All right, folks, here's what we're going to talk about in this video briefly. I just want to show you how to calculate consumers or consumer surplus or consumers surplus, producers surplus, and deadweight loss. Now, I'm not going to really talk in this video about what these three things are, other than to show you where they are or where they can be found on a market graph. You should look in your textbook or look up a video or look up some kind of other material that will explain consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss so that you can have an understanding of what these concepts are. But like I said, all I'm going to do right here is I'm just simply going to show you how to calculate these three amounts. Okay? So here's a market graph. We've got a supply curve. We've got a demand curve. And as you can see, based on this graph, we have an equilibrium price, P sub E. We've got an equilibrium price of $80, and we have an equilibrium quantity of 450 units. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is that when a market is in equilibrium, when the market is operating at equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, then there is no deadweight loss. Deadweight loss will actually be zero. This is considered to be the most efficient price and quantity in this market. Okay? We usually only get a deadweight loss when the government or certain businesses or groups of businesses push their power on the market to change the price and to change the quantity supplied, or the quantity, well, oftentimes the quantity supplied. So here's what I need you to understand, is that we're calculating consumer surplus and producer surplus, and this triangle right here, that is consumers surplus. And the area of that triangle is the value of consumer surplus. This triangle down here, that is producers surplus. And so the area of a triangle, the area of the triangle is equal to either consumer surplus or producer's surplus. It's the same thing for deadweight loss. Deadweight loss winds up being a triangle also. And so we can just find the area of a triangle to find consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. Now, if you're in a more advanced economics class, then you're not going to simply use the area of a triangle. You're probably going to use calculus to determine that area, because you're not going to be dealing with straight lines. Okay? But in a basic economics class, you should be dealing probably with straight lines. The area of a triangle, in case you're not sure, if you don't remember the formula for the area of a triangle, area is equal to 1/2 times base times height, or just 1/2 base times height. 1/2 base times height. So that's all you're going to be doing here. To calculate consumer surplus, you're going to do 1/2 base times height. Producer surplus, 1/2 base times height. Deadweight loss, 1/2 base times height. The question is, how do we find the base and how do we find the height of these triangles? Well, producer surplus, also I want to warn you that when we get to the situation where there's a deadweight loss, it's not going to be just a triangle, it's actually going to be a triangle and a rectangle. But rectangles are even easier, they're just base times height. So let's do a couple examples here. Let's say that the market is operating at equilibrium price. If the market is operating at equilibrium price, we have a triangle for producer surplus right here, this triangle. And this triangle is consumer surplus. Now, consumer surplus is obviously larger than producer surplus in this situation, but you can just as easily have a situation where it's the other way around or where they're both equal. there's not going to be any deadweight loss. The deadweight loss would be over here in this corner right here. It would be a triangle created over here. But because this market is operating at efficiency, at an efficient price and an efficient quantity, there is no deadweight loss, which is a good thing. Well, presumably a good thing. Now, here's what I want you to notice, is that these two triangles are right triangles. They're both right triangles. That's a right triangle, and this one, the producer surplus, is also a right triangle. And in a right triangle, the legs of the triangle are the base and the height. And so here's what we're going to say, is that for the consumer surplus, this line right here, starting here and going up to here, is the height of the triangle. And the distance from here all the way over to here, that's the base of the triangle. Same thing for producer surplus. The height is the distance from here to here. That's the height. And the base is the distance from here to here, base. So the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in an efficient market, they have the same base, but they'll have different heights. They could have different heights. Okay? So if we want to know consumer surplus in this situation, what is the height? Well, the height is the price at the top. See this 200? Minus the price down here at the bottom of the triangle. So the distance from here to here is 200 minus 80. And 200 minus 80 is 120. In fact, I can show it to you. Starting at 80, we're going 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, then 120. So the distance from here to here is 120. So consumer surplus is going to be 1/2 times whatever the base is, and then the height, in this case, is 120. Now the base is the distance from here to here, which, look, happens to be the equilibrium quantity. The distance from here to here is 450. So we're going to put a 450 in here. And now we can just grab a calculator, and we can calculate 1/2 times 450 times 120. So 1/2 times 450 times 120, and I get 27,000. And so the consumer surplus in this market right now is $27,000. Now to calculate producer surplus, we'll do the exact same thing. Only now the height is from here up to here. Well, this is 20. Then we're going up to 80. 80 minus 20 is 60. And we can count even. This is 20, 40, 60. So the height of the producer surplus triangle is 60. And the base, again, is 450. So producer surplus is going to be 1/2 times 450, that's the base, times the height is 60. And since this is half of 120 and the other numbers are the same, we know that the answer to this is going to be this half of that. But let's go ahead and key it in anyway. 1/2 times 450 times 60 is $13,500. $13,500. And because this market is operating at equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, the deadweight loss is 0. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do an example where the price is higher than the equilibrium price. All right, look at this situation. Let's say we have the same market conditions, the same supply curve, same demand curve. Okay, equilibrium price is still 80, equilibrium quantity is still 450. But someone like the government or a group of businesses that all get together, and it's called collusion. Businesses get together and say, hey, let's not sell at equilibrium price, let's raise the price. Now that's illegal, and there are antitrust laws in the United States that prohibit businesses from doing that, but that doesn't mean that they can't do it what's called tacitly, without really being able to be proven that they did it. Okay, but let's say that either a group of businesses or the government come in and they say, you know what? Let's force the price to be $120. Now, at $120 per unit, suppliers are willing to produce and sell 750, but demanders are only willing to buy 300. And whichever number is lower is the one that's going to happen in the market. Okay? So the quantity that's going to be produced and sold in the market is 300 units. And so what you can see here now is that the consumer surplus triangle is now smaller because the bottom of the consumer surplus is always the price. And so the triangle used to be much larger, but now look, it's a much tinier triangle here. So this is, let's use green here. This triangle right here is consumers surplus. Okay? So let's go ahead and calculate consumer surplus. It's still a triangle, so it's still going to be 1/2 base times height. Only now the base goes from here only to here. The base is now 300, and the height goes from here to here. 200 minus 120, that's 80. So consumer surplus is going to be equal to 1/2. The base is now 300 because quantity went down to 300. And the height is 80. So if we do this in a calculator, we'll do 1/2 times 300 times 80. That gives us 12,000. And what has happened is, so consumer surplus before, when it was an efficient market, consumer surplus was 27,000. Now it's 12,000. Consumer surplus has gone down by 15,000 because of this imposed higher price. Consumers are getting less benefit from this market, okay, due to the inefficiency. Now, what we had before was 27,000 for consumer surplus, and we had 13,500 for producer surplus, for a total surplus of 40,500. And what you might think, and this would be an error, in fact, if businesses think this, they are messed up in the head. They need to understand this. Just because consumer surplus went down to 12,000 doesn't mean that producer surplus is now going to be like 28,500. Producers don't get the balance of the surplus because quantity went down. Producers will probably get more surplus, but there's going to be a loss of surplus, and that loss of surplus is in this triangle right here, because this triangle is unproduced potential. It could potentially be produced and consumed, but it's not being produced and consumed because the price is too high. This is what's called the deadweight loss. This is the deadweight loss, this triangle right in here. We'll calculate that in a couple minutes. What I do want to show you here is that producer surplus is this weird looking trapezoid right here. That's a trapezoid. And this trapezoid is made up of a rectangle. Let's see if I got that. Yeah, I got that in the right place. A rectangle and a triangle. This whole thing is producer surplus. Producer surplus. Okay, here and down here. So what we have to do to find producer surplus is we need to calculate the area of the rectangle and this little triangle here. The rectangle goes from 60 up to 120. That's 60 by, from here over to here, is 300. So it's a 60 by 300 rectangle. So producer surplus is going to be, the rectangle is base times height. So that's 300 times 60 plus the triangle. That's going to be 1/2. And now look, the triangle here, here's the base, still it's above it. The base is 300. But now the height of this little triangle only goes from 20 up to 60. 60 minus 20 is 40, right? So that's 40. And so now when we calculate this, that'll be the producer's surplus. Okay, so we're going to do 300 times 60 plus 1/2 times 300 times 40. And that gives us 24,000. So they did have an increase in producer surplus, and that was very selfish of them to force an inefficiency. People say, yes, selfish. Businesses are in business to make money. Yeah, I get that. But businesses are not in business. They should not be, in my opinion, they should not be in business to make markets less efficient, to limit the consumer satisfaction that can be achieved by an economy or in a market just so that they personally can get more satisfaction. Then that's just my opinion. It's just my opinion. Okay? All right. All right, so now This triangle here is a deadweight loss. And the first thing I want to tell you is you don't necessarily have to calculate this triangle. All you have to do is add these two up, that's 36,000, and subtract it from the total surplus, 40,500. So really it should be 40,500. If we add these two, that's 36,000 minus 36,000, which would be 4,500. Now, we're going to calculate the triangle, but I'm going to show you that the triangle is going to wind up being equal to 4,500. Deadweight loss here is going to be a triangle, 1/2. Now, this triangle is not a right triangle, so we have to draw an altitude. An altitude is a right angle line from one of the vertices of the triangle to the base on the other side. Okay, and that length right there is the distance between 300 and 450. I mean, really what it is it's the equilibrium quantity minus the quantity we're producing now. So the equilibrium quantity is 450. The quantity we're producing now is 300. 450 minus 300 is 150. So the base of this, or the height of this triangle, is 450. And then the base is the distance from here to here. And the distance from here to here is the distance between, that's 120, that's 120, a price of 120. This price down here is a price of 60. 120 minus 60, that distance right there is 60. And so it's going to be 1/2 times 150 times 60. And let's see if that comes up to $4,500. 1/2 times 150 times 60, and that's 4,500. Yep. So the deadweight loss in this economy due to the imposed higher price is 4,500. And that is how you calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss when the price is artificially set high. Now we're going to do one more example. We're going to do an example where the price is artificially set low. All right, so same market, same situation, same supply curve, same demand curve. But now look what's happening is that the price is being artificially set low. Instead of being at equilibrium at $80, it's artificially set low at $60. Now, why could this happen? Well, the government may feel like businesses are taking advantage of the customers, or they may say, hey, this is a product that customers need. So a lot of people can't afford it. So we're going to tell you, you are not allowed to charge them more than $60 for this product because they really need it. And so here's the business. The business says, okay, but we're only willing to produce 300, so not as many people are going to get it anyways. If you leave us alone, 450 people are going to get it. I know that people are going to demand about like 500 or 550 at that price, but we are not making 500 and 550. You can tell us we can't charge more than a higher price, but you can't tell us that we have to produce more. So now oftentimes what will happen in these markets in the long run is the price is kept at 60 and the business will figure out how to make it at 60 and make more. Or other businesses will come into the industry and they'll be like, well, we can make it for $60 and sell it for $60, no big deal. So it's not like this is the way it would stay forever, or eventually the price would have to be increased. The government may say, okay, look, you can charge more so people can get more. But here's the deal. We want to calculate the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the deadweight loss. Now, notice the distance between the supply curve and the price now, this is the producer surplus, it is much smaller. It has shrunk considerably. And if we go all the way up to the demand curve here, right, this area, this huge area right here is the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus looks a little bit bigger. So now in order to calculate consumer surplus, we're going to need a rectangle, and a triangle. So now this big trapezoidal thing, that is consumer surplus. And then this area over here, that's the deadweight loss. We'll calculate that in a little bit. So let's start with consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is a rectangle plus a triangle. The rectangle is base times height. The base of this rectangle goes from 0 to 300, so the base is 300. And the height goes from 60 up to 120, so that means a height of 60. So 60 times 300. So 60 times 300 plus, we got this triangle here. The triangle also has a base of 300 from here out to here, which is 300. And the height of this triangle goes from 120 up to 200. Well, that's a height of 80. And so it's going to be 1/2 base, which is 300, times height, which is 80. So we'll put that whole thing in a calculator. All right, so we'll do 60 times 300 plus 1/2 times 300 times 80. And we'll get 30,000. Wow, that's an increase in consumer surplus. In the efficient market, they only had 27,000. Now let's look at producer surplus. Producer surplus, this little tiny triangle here, well, it's not that tiny, but it's still a small triangle, has a base of 300 and a height that goes from 20 to 60, so that's only 40. So this is 1/2 times 40 times 300. 1/2 times, well, the base is 300, not that it matters, times 40, the height. And that gives us 1/2 times 300 times 40. That gives us 6,000. So producer surplus is 6,000. And again, our total surplus from the efficient market was 40,500. So we could just subtract these two numbers from 40,500 to get the deadweight loss. But we're going to calculate the deadweight loss here. The distance from the equilibrium intersection over to the deadweight loss, the base of the triangle, is, again, it's the distance between equilibrium quantity and our quantity. So the quantity supplied is going to be 300, and the equilibrium quantity is 450. 450 minus 300, that's 100. So this deadweight loss is going to be 1/2 times 150. And then the height of this triangle, or the base of this triangle, I really should say, is going to go from 60 up to 120, and 120 minus 60, that's 60. So that's 60. And what we're calculating is the area of this triangle right here. And this triangle has a height that runs from here to here, that's 150, and a base from here to here of 60. And 60 times 150, and 1/2 of that times 150 times 60 is 4,500. And so that is the deadweight loss. You may have to watch this video a couple times, I think, to really, if you're still a little confused, I recommend you watch this video a couple times, write out the calculations, and I think you'll be okay for the quiz and also for the test. Let me know if you have any questions, but that's it.